And welcome to what is going to be the last ever episode of Tech Talk, because very exciting. We've worked out we need to change the name because we're about to turn this also into a podcast, and there's about a gazillion podcasts out there already called Tech Talk. So we'll unveil that in a minute, but thanks for joining us today. I'm with you from Gadigal land here in Sydney in about the 15th week, I think, of the Great Lockdown. And I'm here as the director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology. Our regular panel joining me from Melbourne, where we've had earthquakes, riots and pestilence this week, Lizzie O'Shea, and a grand final public holiday without a grand final. Lizzie, thanks for being with us.
Second most sacred day of the year, obviously tomorrow being the most.
Yeah. And then over in Perth, behind the Great Wall of Mark McGowan and the AFL Grand Final, I'm Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia. Dan, thanks for joining us as well.
Hello, folks. Yes, I'm looking forward to the Grand Final tomorrow. Sorry, I am going. I'll let you know how it goes.
Really? First,
yeah.
Very, very exciting. So yes, the last ever Tech Talk, we are going to become, drum roll, and we've been sort of debating this, and we could even do a bit of a vote if we need to. I'm voting for burning platforms because I just love the idea that the whole thing should sort of go on fire, and there's some lovely images there as well. Lizzie, you were pitching for a few more cerebral ideas as well, including one about philosophy and politics or something, was it?
Yeah, poetical philosophy, which is what I'm a big fan of Ada Lovelace, who's obviously the first person to ever write a paper on computing. She made the leap from calculation to computation, and she was the daughter of Lord Byron, and her mother didn't want her to turn out like her father, who she thought was, well, mad, bad and dangerous to know. And so she warned her off poetry in favour of maths. And then she said, well, I'm bridging this gap between poetry and mathematics, and she called it poetical philosophy. But that sounds, I think, probably far too pretentious. So I backed off on that.
I feel so, yeah. So, Dan, have you got anything better than burning platforms, or is burning platforms it?
I think I said to you, I'm probably the most boring person in this forum today and have no ideas of my own. So I'm gonna vote for burning platforms instead.
So maybe we should call it electric. Well, we should call it electric sheep. You know, like a bit of Philco Dick, and Dan can be our electric sheep. Anyway.
Thanks, Lizzie. That's
all right. Well, we're down to two anyway. Anyway, welcome to either the first ever episode of Burning Platforms or Electric Sheep, to be confirmed. The format for this discussion is we go over the news of the week in the first half hour, and then a focused discussion on a deep dive issue in the second half. We're really glad to have Marie Johnson and Ed Santow with us, and we'll be hearing from them in the second half hour. Please use the chat, introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining us from. If you've got comments or questions, please get busy in there so that we know sort of whether we're pitching the discussion at the right level or not, and pull out your fantastic insights as well. So let's talk about some of the big issues that have been in the news this past fortnight. Lizzie, your choice has been some proposed regulation of Amazon in the context of workplace surveillance.
Yeah, well, we've talked a bit about Amazon this year because there've been moves to unionize some of the warehouses in the United States. They were ultimately unsuccessful in that direct issue, but it has sparked a broader conversation, I think, about what it's like to work in warehouses like Amazon fulfillment centers and what we can do about it. And it's interesting, I think, because we often talk about automation around the context of it meaning there's fewer jobs, but we don't often talk about it meaning that there's fewer bosses or there's fewer managers. And we don't often talk about the automation of management. And in fact, what's clear in the pandemic for people working from home, but also in the context of a company like Amazon, is that there are more and more productivity metrics available to companies, whether that's on Microsoft Office with very invasive productivity tools that can help you measure things in micro units, or it's something like Amazon where workers in fulfillment centers have to run around with a scanning gun to collect items for packaging and dispatch, and the company can track what they do pretty much all the time they're at work. And what this was sparked by was a woman who was essentially automatically fired because she took too much time off task, which is what it's called when you're not scanning items with your scan gun in an Amazon fulfillment center. She took 60 minutes in the course of her shift, and partly it's because bathrooms in fulfillment centers at Amazon tend to be a long way from the floor in which you're working. There's a great book on this, which I can post in the comments if you're interested, which documents a journalist going to work in a fulfillment center. And it's really kind of frightening how long it takes to get to your start point, and then you're stuck in these endless shelves that stretch for miles. So even going to the bathroom can take a lot of time. This woman took 60 minutes to go to the bathroom 3 times in the course of an 8-hour shift and was automatically terminated. And so what has been introduced in response to that example, but also workers organising, because she's gone on to be an organiser of workers in warehouses, you know, spurred by also, I think, unions taking an active role in this field, is a proposed piece of legislation in California, which is designed to address some of these issues. So it's looking at making sure that productivity quotas, well, as a first step, are made known to the people who are working under them. So it's clear what's expected of you and what might put your employment at risk. Because what's clear as well is that people who work in Amazon warehouses don't actually know what productivity metrics they're measured against, their performance is measured against. And then also they're required to disclose it to government. But also a few things like, prohibition on taking retaliation against employees who complain about those kinds of metrics, and also presumption in place that if you, for safety reasons, need to access things like hydration or going to the bathroom, that you be permitted to do so. And so I think it's an interesting piece of legislation. Lauren Kelly, who's a fellow board member of mine on Digital Rights Watch, she talks a lot about digital rights with me, obviously, all the time. And one of the things she points out is we talk about rights in a democracy, but one of the places where it's not a democracy is a workplace. And you have very few rights, in fact. And so it is then, I think, incumbent upon government to look at ways to limit that kind of dictatorship and the worst excesses of that dictatorship, and how technology can be used to really make workers' lives a misery, which I think is what's happening with lots of surveillance technology in the workplace.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, again, California, which is the home of the big tech empires, is also leading the way with some of the regulation. Here in New South Wales, there is the beginnings of an attempt to think through workplace surveillance with an inquiry in our upper house at the moment. And one of the areas which we've urged legislators to look at is the way that surveillance almost creates a secondary market in labour, so that if you, particularly working from home, which is a different context, obviously, to being an Amazon warehouse, but if you are working all day with and producing knowledge information that is also monitored and then repurposed for a financial benefit, who should own that? So who should own the incidental piles of data that we all stack off every day, whether we're filling up our Slack channel or we're entering our Workflow Max or whatever system we're working on, and we know that they're set up to deliver extra value to employers, right?
Yeah, or even worse than that, there was a company in here in Australia that was requiring that employees give blood before they enter the workplace as part of a security dynamic, and a worker eventually took them to court and refused, and he was successful, but basically on a technicality. There's not actually a limit on what they can ask of you. And part of the thing I think that's very concerning about this is you're also handing a lot of information over to some third company that's contracted potentially with your employer, who then holds all this information about you as well, over which you don't have any control. And so as the dynamic of surveillance in the workplace becomes more invasive, it doesn't just limit your rights in the workplace, it does also potentially have an impact on your life outside of work in quite intense ways, and should therefore be the focus. So yeah, it's interesting it's also in California, because California is often seen as a leader when it comes to labour regulation as well. I mean, it's obviously the home of some of these big tech companies, but I'm reasonably hopeful that this could be a beacon that other jurisdictions follow in terms of improving the lives of workers who are vulnerable because they don't have a lot of bargaining power. And, you know, in the case of Amazon, the company's actively resisted unionisation, which might be able to rebalance that.
Dan, is someone that runs a lot of stuff. What are the sort of some of the issues that you see arising from this work?
look, what this story reminded me of actually is something closer to home, and that's robo-debt, and the fact that you've effectively outsourced some quite significant decision making to a machine without proper human oversight of it. So, I mean, go California. I'm not an expert on the law, Lizzie, but from what you've just said, I mean, it sounds like this is absolutely a step in the right direction. I mean, it just highlights the trend to me, which I think, again, we've spoken in this forum about quite significantly, and that is that we're outsourcing more and more of these things to machines without necessarily taking the time to consider what the implications are of these things, or at least having human oversight of what they could be. Someone being fired because they, computer says no is obviously a pretty bad outcome, right? So, yeah, I mean, I hope that California leads the way on this, and this ends up becoming something which is sort of enacted around the world. Thinking closer to home, Peter, at The Guardian, I mean, we don't have anything like this where we're tracking our workers. It's and I don't know many companies that do, but it's been interesting actually over the last 18 months.
Have you been pushed product though? Like, are people trying to sell you on the dream of getting more out of your employees?
Yeah, 100%. And this is the thing. So I've been approached by numerous third-party companies, which on the basis that they can provide much better surveillance of our employees and the work that they are doing, because we're not in the office and therefore able to witness them. It's completely unnecessary in my view. And if anything, what the pandemic has taught us is that if you trust workers to do their job, they inevitably do, with very, very few examples. At least that's my experience. Oh, sorry, exceptions. At least that's my experience. So, but yeah, I mean, look, once again, less faith in machines, please, I think is probably a good starting point.
Excellent. Okay, we'll move on to my offering this week, which is really my colleague Jordan's fantastic paper he put out this week that I've just put in the chat around influencers, which is another area where you've got the rules for the old world, and then a disruption, which is the role of individuals with big followings who can then create a market in products and services, wanting to pay them to distribute, endorsements on Instagram or other platforms. And Jordan's had a look at this, and particularly the double. If you're an individual, there's some very light touch codes of conduct, but nothing enforceable. Whereas if you are purporting to give financial advice or health advice or fitness advice, there's a whole range of standards that you need to comply with. So again, we've got this situation where we've got a new entrant into the ecosystem who, and with real value as well in terms of distributing content around and building reach for products and services, but without the guardrails that have been put in place in the real world. So interesting in your guys' reflections on that. There's a bunch of recommendations we put forward, but it's really to have a proper look at how this system's working. Have I done justice to that, Jordan?
You did great. Yeah, bang on.
You. What do you reckon, Lizzie?
Well, I want to ask Dan a question actually, because one thing I wonder about influencers is they often are used by small to medium enterprises rather than large businesses to push their products. And one of the things I think about social media is there's a lot of assumptions about how effective it is as a platform for advertising and how much work influencers do. And the businesses that are purchasing that advertising capacity aren't always in a position to meaningfully isolate the utility of it for their business. And they can be, I think, quite easily duped. There was a really interesting SBS doco, I think, a little while back about influencers and how, this woman essentially created a fake influencer account and took a whole lot of endorsements and made a bit of money, but didn't actually do much with it. She purchased fake followers and the like. I don't know, Dan, do you think there is a bit of mythology around the actual capacity of social media to deliver on some of these advertising promises? Because they talk all about this really fine-grained data that they can use to, curate audiences for you. And I do wonder how effective it actually is.
Are you asking me to comment on whether I think social media is an effective advertising vehicle? The answer would be no. The Guardian is a much more effective advertising vehicle. But no, in all seriousness, I think this had a moment, right? So there was a period when it was sort of an evolution, if you like, of the endorsement, the famous person endorsement. And the difference is that there was all these influencers, obviously, that were getting these huge followings that weren't necessarily famous for anything other than what they were doing on Instagram or Snapchat or whatever else. I think there was a big rush of both big brands and small brands piling into this, and it's sort of come back a little bit as some of these problems have been exposed, including some of the ones that you've referenced, Lizzie, with people setting up fake followers and whatever else. The problem with a lot of this is you're effectively paying someone to put out a post on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, name your social media channel, and there's no independent verification of how that goes. And so it's quite easy for advertisers to be duped by it. The other part of this, which is difficult, is, all significant advertisers sign up to a voluntary advertising code of ethics in Australia, which is run by the Australian Association of National Advertisers. And people can make complaints about ads to the Ad Standards Board, and some of the complaints that you've identified, or some of the issues that you've identified, Lizzie, could be made, a complaint could be made to that board. The problem, though, is a lot of these influencers either don't know this exists, or if they do know it exists, it's just too easy for them to flout it. And it's too easy for an influencer to be able to do a sponsored post without declaring that it's a sponsored post. And so that's actually a much bigger problem, is that we see a lot of these influencers that are doing posts that they claim to be organic, they just love this product. And as it turns out, they're being paid for it and no one is any the wiser. And there's no sort of independent verification of that. So they're largely getting away with it. I don't know what the answer is other than advertising mainstream media, but that's my answer for everything.
Yeah, the other interesting point is at what point, for instance, political parties start also accessing influencers to promote their messages. And I'm aware that it does happen. So there is no transparency on that. There is no authorization at the bottom of an influencer being paid to push forward political content. So it does create, on one level, you could say that influencing is a fantastic democratization of celebrity. It's no longer determined by, the Murdoch or TV Times or whatever. The audience picks themselves. It's just what you do with the value of that network. I think that's really interesting.
Do you reckon lots of people think influencers are a positive thing? I feel like most people don't. The incentives that it creates for people to kind of completely commodify their lives and then often push content. I mean, we're going to talk about this in a minute, I think, but, that can be very harmful for young people who don't get to see the full picture of people's lives and instead see a very curated aspect of it and often measure themselves against it. I'm not sure I'm interested in the democratization of celebrity, I have to tell you.
But that's actually a critique of celebrity as much as a critique of influencing, right?
No, anyway, I'm not against that, but it's the monetization and the decentralization of celebrity. I'm not sure that's necessarily an inherent good, I suppose, is my question. Yeah.
I think you're probably right. Kicking on to Dan's contribution, there was a fantastic series in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, the Facebook Files. They got their hands on a bunch of internal documents and they fed it out with significant analysis, a whole bunch of revelations, including the fact that Facebook knew full well that Instagram was causing damage to teenage girls, that the moderation systems that they'd set up exempted VIPs and high flyers, that Facebook was ignoring flags on drug cartels and human trafficking. But the piece Dan was going to focus on, I think, was the algorithmic change in 2018, which really was pitched as a positive after the 2016 debacle of the Trump election, Dan.
Yeah, so look, this was some really fantastic reporting from the Wall Street Journal, and there were 5 parts to it. But the piece I want to speak to today is the part which relates to the change that was made to the Facebook algorithm in 2018. It was quite a public change. Mark Zuckerberg spoke about it on a couple of occasions publicly and made the point that they were going to be downweighting, if you like, or reducing the prominence of professionally produced content and increasing the prominence of content from friends and family. And they positioned this as a way, because they were doing this effectively, to make Facebook a healthier place and less divisive. It's had the exact opposite effect. What this this reporting has uncovered is that the motivation for Facebook doing this was not so much those high and lofty goals that Zuckerberg mentioned. It was more that they were concerned that the engagement levels were consistently dropping in the newsfeed, because people were, on the whole, reading lots of news content from professional publishers or watching lots of videos, rather than directly engaging, liking, sharing posts, commenting on posts. And so what this change did is it prioritized the kinds of content that was going to result in more comments. And unfortunately, the outcome of that was that the more controversial the post, the more times it was shared, the more engagement that received from the audience. And it worked. I mean, engagement went massively up after this change. The problem was it made Facebook a much angrier place. And also it meant that the kinds of content that people were consuming on Facebook, relative to what they were consuming before, was far more sensationalist. And I think this is perhaps what has probably not started, but certainly spurred on and accelerated this trend towards conspiracy theory thinking and divisiveness on the platform. Now, I know we're going to talk about algorithms in a lot of detail in a second, but the one point I'd make on this is a one that I've made many times on this before. It's just, it was such an important algorithm change. We know in Australia that about 25% of people get their news exclusively from social media, meaning Facebook. And yet it was made without any oversight. And the outcome was clearly that it's made Facebook more divisive. And yet there's been no change and no impact for the company. So again, I think it demonstrates that we need much greater oversight over these things. But
if you helicopter it out, it's hardly surprising that the problem they were trying to solve was people were spending too long just looking at curated and professional content, and they wanted to make it more organic. And on one level that kind of makes sense, but if you play it through, the idea that then your world's going to be shaped by conversations and bottom up outrage doesn't sound so surprising. And then but the bit that really got me was then these documents show that Facebook knew it was causing problems. Organizations like BuzzFeed contacted Facebook and said, the worst stories we're writing are going off, and it's creating an incentive to write more of those. Now, you can talk about BuzzFeed's logic there, but that's separate. But it does strike me a little bit like James Hardy realizing that asbestos was causing lung disease and saying, well, let's just put that report in a box and let's keep making money.
I mean, the outcome of this, right, is twofold. The kinds of publishers that ended up going better on it, not just publishers, but the kind of content, but I'll stick with publishers because that's my world for the time being, was the more sensational. So your Sky News, your Daily Mail got more prominence within the newsfeed, or received more prominence in the newsfeed relative to your more traditional vanilla reporting, such as the Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald or even the Australian. So it amplified all the worst kinds of content, if you like. The stat that was most damning, though, or the part of this reporting that I thought was most concerning was one of the recommendations from the Facebook integrity team was that the single greatest thing you can do, the single most effective thing you can do to stop this kind of content from going viral and influencing lots of people is just either reduce or eliminate the ability for people to share this content. So effectively go to an Instagram style model. This was presented to Mark Zuckerberg, and according to this reporting, he went, no, that will hurt engagement, I'm not doing that, and just allowed and bugger the consequences. So I think it's a pretty bad view as to what is, or pretty unsurprising, but pretty damning view of what is most important for Facebook, and confirms a lot of the things that I think we suspected about Facebook in the past.
Lizzie?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because in the podcast about this topic, one of the reporters says, when Facebook started, they didn't really have any rules. And, there's a commenter now in our chat just saying this. They do have rules, which is to maximize shareholder value. And it's not surprising to me that their objective is not to protect people from harm or to create infrastructure for social engagement that serves the public interest. It's actually to maximize value for shareholders. And so engagement is the key metric for that. The systems theorist Stafford Beer like to tell us that the purpose of a system is what it does. And the purpose of Facebook is to make money for shareholders. Engagement is the key vehicle through which they do that. And I think there's a sense that they may have sleepwalked into this of sorts. And I think that does let them off the hook a bit. I think they knew what they were doing. and they have a set of tools at their disposal to achieve a particular outcome. And so intentions aren't really good enough, or a lack of foresight. The other thing that comes to mind when we talk about this is that, Facebook is, I think, more like a government really than a company, because it has a huge amount of power. It facilitates public discussion, but, it's in lots of parts of our lives in a variety of different ways. Even if you're not on Facebook, you'll be affected by decisions made by that company. And it is telling that, I think that also, you were mentioning before, Peter, about what kind of work they did to cover up this research. Well, it's now been revealed, they've got a project called Project Amplify, where they have essentially a form of counterintelligence, where they're putting into the newsfeed positive stories to avoid the alienation of users. This is what kind of authoritarian governments do. They engage in counterintelligence to preserve themselves from backlash by the people. So I do think, there was Brian mentioned, who's a US tech writer. He was on Twitter saying that we need, it's irredeemable, this company, and it needs to shut down. And it's very hard to draw an alternative conclusion. It's just going so far in a particular direction. It feels like there's a lot, there's far too much to be undone in order to get it to a place of functionality. And that's pretty alarming given how powerful it is.
There is an alternative. Sorry, Peter, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say, to Lizzie's point, that the scope of the Wall Street Journal report felt like, a delve into state secrets and the workings of a nation state. And I think that counter propaganda exercise, that's an algorithmic pumping up of Facebook, feels almost Putin-esque in its sort of its ambitions. But Dan, you finish off on this, and then we will go broader even still.
Well, I think there is an alternative. I think it's a pretty unlikely alternative, but an alternative to shutting it down at least. And that is that, I think Nick Clegg has come out publicly with a pretty ambling statement, actually, but nonetheless has said, we're not talking about, at least Facebook is doing this research. Are Snapchat doing this research? Is YouTube doing this research? Now, that might be true. It might be a fair point.
That's hardly a defense.
Oh, look, there's so many things wrong with his response, but I'll put that aside for a second. But one of the things that you could do, one of the things that Facebook could choose to do, is actually go, you know what, we're going to be transparent here. We're going to commission more of this research, not less, and we're going to be transparent of the findings, and we're going to allow academics to assess the impact of our algorithm, and we're going to allow, we recognise the central role that we play in the information economy, and therefore we recognise that it can't all be left up to us, and therefore we're going to be transparent, we're going to allow third parties to assess it. And if they did that, it would also encourage other social media platforms, including the ones that Nick Clegg was complaining about for not doing this research, to do the same thing, and it would ultimately improve the overall environment that these companies operate in.
But if push comes to shove and Zuckerberg says, thanks for your work, but I'm going to keep making money, it doesn't really get us anywhere, does it?
No, well, then you come back to, unfortunately, Zuckerberg is all powerful. Even his board has no influence over what he does. So again, I'm not optimistic that this is going to happen, but I think it could happen. This is the answer, right? I think if they're arguing that social media has been a force for good in the world, questionable claim, but if they're arguing that, then fine. Also recognise just how massive and important and central it's become to so many people's lives. You can't keep running it on the whims of one individual in Silicon Valley. You just can't. It's not tenable anymore.
The great segue into the broader discussion around the power of algorithms. I want to bring into the discussion Marie, who came to our attention with a great piece in Innovation Oz this week, where she coined, I don't know if it's your phrase, but at least she used the term algorithmic industrial complex, which for those of us who sort of did our political economy back in the 80s and 90s, the military industrial complex was a way of understanding the geopolitics of the Cold War and beyond. So welcome, Maria. Do you want to sort of just expand on your thesis a little bit?
Oh, thank you very much. And thrilled that the paper or the article got your attention in the way that it did. I'm speaking today in Canberra, so the traditional land of the Ngunnawal people. And I'd just like to open up by acknowledging the traditional owners here today. My article was based on my observations and experience over a number of years as to the machinery of government. And I'm making these observations as someone who's been inside, as well as someone who's worked on the outside as well. And the power differential, which I think is part of this, is something incredibly important to understand. And it's not just the power differential between an algorithm and a person who is subject to that algorithm, but it's a power differential between the state. The 20 years, over the last 20 years, there has been a real hollowing out of capability in the public sector. And at the same time, there has been enormous growth in capability in these spaces, in technology and digital algorithms elsewhere. So what we see is this power differential rising, very, very similar, if you like, trends to the military industrial complex and also into the medical industrial complex, which has also been characterized by some of these same common patterns. So the enabling environment is starting to look like that. Then we start to observe actions by government which actually are not challenged, and these legislations and ways of policy are more or less just starting to happen, not just in Australia, but we see this United Kingdom and United States elsewhere. From our experience in Australia, my direct experience with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and I've also worked in Department of Human Services, what is happening in those areas is the rise of algorithms where people are defined by personas. So there's a whole lot of work that goes into the definition of personas, which are not transparent. There's been, no, if you like, transparency about how these personas are developed. On the basis of those personas, then robo plans are developed. And on the basis of those robo plans, robo decisions are made. So this is a common pattern that I've observed then from also robo-debt. And in recent weeks, new social security legislation, a draft legislation also was introduced, which also spoke about technological processes by which different factors would be taken into account in determining what streams people would be put into for job placement. And these streams would give rise to a plan. So a plan for a person to seek employment. And the way in which these plans then are managed is through an algorithm. Did you undertake all the activities associated with this plan in your job seeking activities? So we see some common terminology making its way into the policy vernacular. One is plans. So this is your NDIS plan, or this is your job seeking plan. Make no mistake, there will be a veterans plan, and there will also be, health plans and so forth. And so there's plans, there's participants. So if you're a participant, you're an NDIS participant, or you might be a job seeking participant, or you might be a veteran seeking services, so you'll be a veteran participant. So very, very common ways of describing people. And then these plans, and then the robo decisions that are made on the basis of your performance on those plans. The only way these policy constructs can actually be achieved is through algorithms. There is no other way that this level of control can be undertaken except for the application of algorithms. And that, I think, presents a shift in our policy environment, that it's no longer just government administration and potentially the outsourcing to a contracted service provider as part of that supply chain for the delivery. It's actually dependent on algorithms. The policy otherwise would not even be possible without an algorithm. And so the problem then is there is no oversight over this. And these same common patterns, so I've just spoken about the Commonwealth government in Australia, very similar patterns were seen in the United States. I think it might have been The Guardian, had an article about very, very similar pattern of people being assessed for their, in fact, it was disability healthcare support. Very, very same pattern. People were assessed via an algorithm. There was a plan developed. There was budget associated with that plan, which lacked any context. And as a result, actually many people died in very difficult circumstances because they didn't have enough funding to survive. Mm. So I guess my purpose in the article was saying a couple of things. And, you know, kudos to Ed in his work on the in the human rights technology paper for starting to call this out, because what is not contemplated anywhere is the additive impact of algorithms, mostly on the most vulnerable. So it's not just about one algorithm, it's about the additive impact of those algorithms. So you could have a person in the Social Security job-seeking algorithm who has a job-seeking plan determined by the algorithm. They have to go and apply for a certain number of jobs. And of course, then many employers now have recruitment systems run by algorithm. So these people, if you like, are being reduced to data elements in the government algorithm and then discarded as, if you like, non-competitive in the employment algorithm of a company. What really concerned me is that the rise of these algorithms, there's been a lot of discussion in civil society actually about the danger of these algorithms. But with the NDIS Senate inquiry into independent assessments, which is where for the NDIS a lot of this started, there were over 370 submissions. Mostly all of them were highlighting the problems of the application of these algorithms to people who are incredibly not only vulnerable, but already significantly disadvantaged. But not one submission from the technology sector, who are the vendors of these algorithms.
So I might bring Ed in on that. Sorry, yeah. Marie. So for those that don't know Ed, former Human Rights Commissioner, now a real citizen again. Welcome, Ed. A lot of your work was dealing with these issues. I'm interested to what extent you found this phenomena being vendor driven as well.
I think maybe we need to take one step back, because I think Murray has just given like a real tour de force in understanding how these algorithms are kind of increasing, why and what some of the problems are. You know, if you take a step back and what we did was we just asked people in Australia and a bit overseas as well, what they felt about decision making by humans and decision making using algorithms. And one of the things that people kept on saying to us, which I was a little bit surprised about, was incredibly pragmatic. They said, well, I don't really care that much if, you know, a decision, even a really significant decision, is made by a human or a machine, or some kind of combination of both. What I really care about is that it has to be fair, it has to be accurate, and it has to be accountable. So there's three things: fairness, accuracy, and accountability are crucially important. And the problem is that for some types of decision making, particularly the sort of decision making that Murray is talking about in the welfare area, and a range of decisions that are not binary yes, no, factual decisions, it's much harder to use an algorithm and really achieve those three things: fairness, accuracy, and accountability. And you can do it cheaply, and it'd be much cheaper and more efficient, in inverted commas, if you don't care about those principles very much. But Australians, unsurprisingly, do really care about those things. So that has to be, I think, our lodestar. If a company or a government agency is thinking about automating or using AI to make significant decisions, it has to show that its decision-making process is going to be fair, accurate, and accountable. And it's certainly not going to be any worse on those measures than the kind of system that it replaces.
And isn't this the main issue here, though, right? Is that the problem with an algorithm is that it's complicated and usually not transparent. So the problem is that you've got these decision-making algorithms that are developed, and because they're not transparent, it's almost impossible for someone to determine whether they're fair or not, to reference your research. So, I mean, it almost feels like there's just got to be a cultural shift here. I'm thinking out loud, but something along the lines of whenever there is an algorithm that is involved in making a significant decision, there's almost got to be an obligation on every organisation that does this to be transparent with the key drivers of that algorithm. I mean, would that be a potential solution to this?
Absolutely. So a big focus on was on transparency, but it can't just be transparency. I mean, human decision makers, I'm saying that as if I'm not a human. We human decision makers are not completely transparent ourselves, right? We all know if we're going to do something, if we're going to make a decision that is basically really prejudiced, which happens sadly every day of the week in Australia, not any of us on this call, but others, most people know enough to hide your true motivation. So if you're going to not hire someone because they have a disability and you just can't work out how that is going to work in your organization, you're going to say, oh, no, the reason you didn't get a job, it's got nothing to do with your disability. It's because there was this other person who was much more qualified. And so what we've developed over literally hundreds of years is ways to really kind of pick away at the surface justifications that humans make to try and get to the true motivation, to really understand what the basis of a human decision is. And you know what? You can do the same with algorithms as well. It's not perfect. We're not sort of kind of get in the same way that we can't in a human decision get to the absolute 100% truth with certainty, but you can get really confident about what the fundamental basis of a decision is. But that's a choice. It's more expensive.
Yeah, but you can have a conversation with a human where you can't have a conversation with an algorithm, though.
True, but you can interrogate its operation, right? And so there are some quite sophisticated ways of getting to the bottom of it, but it requires the system to be designed in a way that is capable of being interrogated. And that's always a design choice. So if you want to create a black box, if you want to make it really difficult for people to ever get to the bottom of the decisions you're making, then that's a choice as well. But it's a choice that should be, I would say, prohibited if you're ever making a decision that is genuinely affecting people in a significant way.
But that's where Marie's point about the industrial complex part of it comes in, because if you're making algorithms to make money, they're going to be different. Now, Matt was talking on the chat about open source would actually deal with a lot of those issues. Lizzie, what's your take?
Yeah, I think it is interesting to watch Dan in real time come to the conclusion that open source is a good thing. So yeah, I think absolutely.
I saw that in the chat. I wasn't sure that was what I was saying.
that was nice to watch. What I was going to say is I think we also have to be clear about what algorithms can do for us. I read a really what I thought was a very interesting piece of research, which someone had done analysis on ratemyprofessor.com, which is a site where professors are rated, does what it says. And he broke it down by gender, and it turns out that people rate female professors more poorly. They dislike it more when female professors assign them homework, just kind of things that you would instinctively think to be true, but you may not have seen demonstrated in real time. And the conclusion that guy draws is that the traditional the great quote from Marx was, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And he was saying, well, maybe we need to invert that we don't use these algorithms to kind of make decisions to change the world, but we use them to interpret the world as it is. And I think there's some utility in that, because what these systems can tell us is how we are thinking or how we're doing kinds of things. Because the computer aspect is one component, but there's also data aspects and gaps in data that get fed into the computerized system. And sometimes it's not clear that those gaps exist until you've seen a computer interpret it for you. And the obvious example, I think, there is predictive policing, where you think, oh, I'm interested in health and safety. But it turns out if you use, crime statistics as a source of data to inform predictive policing, what you're going to get is more and more policing of certain kinds of communities, because
Correct.
That's the kind of bias that exists in the real world. So there's, it tells us, oh, well, policing is perhaps not interested in safety. It's actually interested in something different, that it can help us interpret how systems in the real world operate and give us then the opportunity to address those problems and to correct, I suppose, human bias, but in, an evidence-based way. But that's not the same as wholesale industrializing government decisions or escalating the efficiency of how the state operates. It's actually about saying, what are we going to use computers for? We're going to use them to try and disorganize the kind of oppression that exists in the real world by helping us make sense of these problems and bringing them to the front of our consciousness.
I think there's a standard for government that really needs to be carefully looked at. And we hear a lot about statements about fairness, and I, for one, challenge that, because I think it's an enormously subjective concept. As applied in the NDIS, is incredibly politicized. The examples in the United States also talk about this incredible bias that's built into people understanding what fairness actually is. In whose context is this fair? And so I think fairness can be a little bit of a marketing grab, particularly by a lot of organisations. But when policy can only be executed at scale by algorithms, and government doesn't have anything to say about it, I think that's a concern. And so we can talk about, we can interrogate an algorithm, or we can speak to a person and so forth. But when policy is being executed at massive scale, when there's high levels of subjectivity around what this notion of fairness is, where you actually can't interrogate the algorithm, and if you asked a public servant to do it, nor would they be able to do it because the skills aren't there. The skills are actually with the companies that will be developing the algorithms. So I think for public administration and trust in government, this is an incredibly important issue that point in time we're at now. I, for one, would like to see the whole discussion around fairness really challenged, because when you are the subject of something that is supposed to be fair, it's highly subjective. And so anyway, that's just my both experience and interpretation of what's going on. I don't think fairness in its own right is enough when the power of the state is executed at scale through algorithms.
Ed, you obviously put a lot of work into this during your time with the Human Rights Commission. You've moved on. Tell us what you're doing now, and particularly what you think is going to happen to your report. And, I'm interested in also what you do with that as a citizen now as well.
Yeah, so our report had a number of findings and recommendations. Findings, I think, have been largely embraced by government and the private sector, which is really good. Some of the recommendations can only be implemented by government. We talked about some tweaks to legislation. And some were a bit more than tweaks, if I'm honest. But on the whole, what we were saying is enforce the existing laws better. Stop ignoring the existing laws and pretending that these are all ethical issues. They're not. There's a whole bunch of laws that could protect our community if they were rigorously enforced. So we worked really closely also with all of Australia's federal regulators, who all have a role to play in doing that. So I'm hopeful, if you put the legislation to one side for a moment, I'm hopeful that the kind of bureaucratic parts of government are all starting to creak into gear a bit better, including, you know, the Human Rights Commission was on a journey as well. And so you know, I was going to say they are still kind of lifting their game too. Legislation, look, this close to an election, I think is probably pretty unlikely, but I'm hopeful after the election that'll be something that can be embraced. But there's a second part to it as well, which is, you know, there's a heck of a lot outside of government that needs to happen too. I think most companies don't want to treat their customers badly. They want to make, you know, decisions efficiently and so on, but you know, then they need to lift their game if they're using these sorts of systems. And so what we've set out really clearly is what they need to do. And you know, frankly, when I was at the commission and then since, I've been inundated with you know, requests saying, okay, we're taking this on, we want to do it. Can you tell us how to do it in this particular context? So that brings me to my current role. So I'm leading this initiative at UTS, University of Technology in Sydney. And it's basically saying, you know, we talk a lot in Australia about a skills gap when it comes to artificial intelligence. And usually what people mean by that is technical skills. You know, we're not pumping out enough people with data science and STEM and all that kind of thing. And that's a real problem, and others are working on it. Good luck to them. But there's another problem, which is just as serious, that no one is talking about. And that is a strategy gap. So if you take RoboDebt as an example, you had very senior people in government who were kind of looking at ways to recoup money back into the welfare system from people who had been paid more than they were entitled to. Then you had a couple of tech companies whispering in their ears saying, hey, you know what, this problem that you've never been able to solve, we can solve it like that. And it'll be using the magic of technology, and you don't need to worry about it. And you know, they were so susceptible to that, right? Like, because wow, this is fantastic. So susceptible that they banked the savings for years into the future before the system had even gone live. Like, it's an extraordinary situation. And then you know, that decision at a very high level then becomes the problem for kind of more people in middle management in government, then to kind of work with the tech company to work out a system to make it all happen. We all know the problems, right? But what we want to do is stop that from ever happening again. If you are a senior person in government or in the private sector, you need to understand, you know, ways in which AI and algorithm is safe to use, things that can be grasped and can really improve lives in the ways that Lizzie, for example, mentioned a moment ago, and areas where the risks are just ridiculously high, and you need to either find a different way to do what you're trying to do, or put in place really tight controls to stop harm from taking place. So that's the big problem we're working on. We want to work with, we will be working with government and the private sector to help them understand that much better, so you can make better decisions and you know, keep Australians safe.
And what about your grand dream of a moratorium on facial recognition technology? Where do you think that's going at the moment, given that we're now looking at home quarantine being driven by?
Yeah, look, I'm kind of tearing my hair out. It feels like a dangerous thing to do at my age, but I am tearing my hair out a bit about it, because we had this bill that the federal government proposed a few years ago. It was a terrible bill. It's called the Identity Matching Services Bill. It was the first bill to get knocked back by the powerful Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament in 15 years. And so they were to go back to the drawing board, put in better privacy and other rights protections. And then what happened was just radio silence. So now we've got the worst of all worlds, in that there's no legislation at all that is there to protect people against harm from the specific problems associated with facial recognition. So that really is a digital Wild West. It's just happening. And so it just seems inevitable that there are going to be huge problems, and by that I really mean real injustice that takes place, and that's probably the thing that will prompt proper action. But what we could do right now is we could have some legal protections put in place to prevent harm, and I wish that would occur.
I like, Ed, your reference to preventing harm, and I think perhaps, you know, the statement about do no harm should be almost the primary statement, you know, in all of this. And I mean, we've spoken before. I loved your proposal for an AI safety commissioner. I think that is something that I hope gets taken up, you know, by some government. In my interpretation of what would be needed would be such a body to undertake or oversee the undertaking of a some sort of an inventory of all algorithms that are used by government, and probably the private sector as well, but let's start by government. And I think it'll be pretty surprising what people actually find. I was contacted just during the week by a senior officer in a government agency who I won't name, who was wanting to talk about their recruitment system, which uses AI. You know, so where do you go on that, right? So I think there does need to be that sort of central body that at least helps coordinate the undertaking of such a, you know, of such an inventory, because then you would get a sense of the overall additive impact of algorithms in different communities. That I think is a massive threat to the risk of harm.
Indeed. We're just coming up to the end of the hour. Thanks for your contribution today, Marie. Thanks for your time, Ed. We hope to see you here more often. Dan and Lizzie, any parting thoughts, anything that we need to be looking out for over the next couple of weeks? Lizzie?
Yeah, well, I would just say as a last pitch before we go that Digital Rights Watch is hosting Imagine on the 30th of September. It's the second in our 4-part series about rebalancing the internet economy for people. And this one's looking at the relationship between digital platforms and writers and bloggers and poets and wordsmiths. So if you're interested in how we can make platforms work for people doing this kind of work, we'd love to have you there. And there'll be 2 other events that look at different kinds of communities using online platforms, including activists and the like, and making that work for people rather than large multinational corporations. We'd love to see you there. So feel free to come along, and you can sign up to Digital Rights Watch's newsletter if you want to learn more about that series.
Great, thanks, Lizzie. And we are expecting imminently the privacy review. So we may be digging down deep into that in a couple of weeks. What else is on your radar, Dan?
And the advertising services, ad tech services review, which is also due to drop next week. So there'll be a bit to talk about. I'll finish on a positive and a negative on the same topic, which is a bit predictable. On the News Media Bargaining Code, I was dismayed this week to learn that the good folk at Facebook have refused to do a deal with both the SBS and The Conversation, as well as many other smaller publishers, which is definitely contrary to the spirit of the code. On the plus side, The Guardian intends to make some very public announcements around the very substantial expansion that we have undertaken and are still undertaking, largely with the help of the deals that we have done with Google and Facebook off the back of the News Media Bargaining Code. So we'll have more to say on that next month.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Lizzie. Everyone have a great weekend. Stay safe. And we will see you in a fortnight for the second edition of Burning Platforms. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.